Okay, welcome to the week two go-to session. This is the second of four sessions we're holding this month. My name is David Sussman. So Miss Fox and Miss Chapman are also here. So we're covering this session for all three of our courses. So by this time in the month, you probably should all be in the correct place. But yeah, we're trading off every week, or pretty much every week. So you'll hear from a different instructor from time to time. I'm covering today's session. Today's session will basically cover the essay. Okay, so week one was largely devoted to research. I'll say more about that in a second and hear some feedback about how things are going. But yeah, we're moving forward. So the essay is due this coming Sunday. This is the major piece of writing for the month, so it's pretty important that we talk about it a bit. And then we'll spend some time in the second half of the lecture talking about APA format, which sometimes scares some students, but I'll try to convince you that it's actually not so scary at all. And we'll look at some examples of APA format, specifically how we handle quotations or any piece of research, whether it's directly quoted or not, and incorporate it into our own writing. Okay, so let's move forward. Let me take a quick sip from my drink. Okay, so if we, here, let me blow this up a bit. Okay, so last week in the week one go-to session, okay, the first class lecture, we talked a bit about the writing process. Remember, we talked about how this is cyclical. It's a process that all writers use. It can be used multiple times when working on a single project. And each of these steps are always covered by every writer. Okay, so week one, you spent basically your time here with brainstorming and research and investigating. The brainstorming probably took the form of just figuring out who you wanted to write about. And then you spent some time researching. Um, Also, researching, for example, will your role model work for this month? In week one, we talked about the importance of finding the right role model because that's pretty crucial for this assignment. You don't want to get stuck with a role model who doesn't have very much written about her or him. So that was kind of step one that often required some at least initial or cursory research. Will your role model work? And the second, once you figured out who your role model was, your task was to find three quality articles that already helped you begin to understand how your role model has faced and solved work-related obstacles. So my first question is, how's the research going, folks? Awesome, frustrating, easy peasy, either in terms of finding an appropriate role model or finding quality articles. Let's see, Alan says so. Getting there. Okay, we see some pretty tentative answers coming from the students. Anybody want to share what the problems are, if there are any, what the specific challenges were? Calvin says it's good. Jameson said, didn't read the instructions properly. Yeah, that's key. Sadly, I do see that happen. So yeah, it's super important that we read through the instruction sheets, that we watch that first go-to lecture. I hate to sound like the mean instructor, but sometimes I tell students, if you're not watching the lectures, that's the equivalent of skipping class. Okay, and if you don't keep up with the materials, you'll probably feel a little bit lost, and there's a greater likelihood that assignments will be completed incorrectly, or you might find yourself in a difficult situation. For example, you find out in week two or week three that your chosen role model just isn't working very well. Maybe you picked a game designer who's too obscure. There's just not much information about him or her. Okay, week one was the time to figure that out, not week two or week three. Alan says, I think this is maybe a challenge, finding good, reliable sources, finding content. I would say to most students to keep digging. I know that sounds general, and I know people have been doing quite a bit of digging, but research takes time. So if it's something that doesn't happen in 30 minutes, that's not very much time at all. It might take hours. I know I recommend to my students not to get too hung up on the searching. For example, let's say you find one quality source on the internet in general, and then remember one source has to come from the Full Sail library database. I tell students, don't get too hung up on doing searches for things like obstacles and setbacks and challenges. and failures. I mean, yeah, certainly do dedicated searches for that kind of stuff, but be open-minded. Sometimes just finding a good in-depth article will be tremendously helpful, because if the article is in-depth and rich, probably issues of perseverance are going to appear in that article somewhere. Um, Either it'll be covered with some care, or maybe it will just be alluded to, but either way, you then know what to research more deeply. So I often encourage students that this is your chance to become a sort of mini expert on your role model, right? And if you're doing enough reading, you're doing enough perusing, you're finding lots of things to read. Chances are, if you spend enough time reading about your role model, you'll find issues of perseverance to write about. That shouldn't be too big of a problem. Let's see, did I miss anything else in the chat? Okay, James says he found an amazing video on this person. Yeah, and that's another thing. Remember, videos work. Interviews. Okay, so broaden your mind. Don't get frustrated if you start Googling or searching the library database, the name of your role model and obstacles, or the name of your role model and perseverance, because chances are you may not find things that are directly that obvious using those keywords. It's more a matter of just getting out there and reading as much as you can in your role model. I often say maybe you'll have to read 7, 10 articles. Yeah, but eventually you'll become that mini expert on your chosen person. And once you become that mini expert, you'll feel pretty comfortable talking about challenges that person has faced. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, week 1 you spent with brainstorming and researching. So now we're moving into the later steps. Okay, organizing your information and then writing it. Okay. For the draft that's due this Sunday. Real quickly, even though we call it a draft, don't think of it in terms of a draft. Usually, when students hear the word draft, they think, oh, a rough draft. I just have to slap some words on the page, or it's okay if it's not that perfect. No, this should be your best effort. You should be writing the best essay you possibly can for where you are right now in the course. Okay, and then in week 3, next week, you'll get feedback from both your instructors and your classmates, and then you'll use that feedback to revise, which you'll hand in at the end of the month. So yeah, we definitely realize that you'll get feedback and you'll make improvements, but you're handing in your best possible work right now. Okay, so it's a draft, yes, but it's not a rough draft. That's what we're working toward. As Ms. Fox points out, a polished draft, right? So it's proofread. It's in the APA format. Okay, we'll talk about APA format later, but APA covers issues about layout, meaning how the paper looks, and then also matters of citation, having those down correct. Yeah, we want all those pieces in place for the draft. Okay, moving on. Just some quick reminders about audience. I'm not going to beat this drum too loudly, because if you took creative presentation, that course spends a lot of time talking about audience. Audience is important no matter the communication situation. So in creative presentation, you worked on, well, presentations, right? For a prospective audience in creative presentation, that was potential employers down the road once you graduated from Full Sail. But just because you've left creative presentation does not mean you've left issues of audience aside. Anytime you deliver a speech, anytime you create a piece of writing, anytime you basically involve yourself in any form of communication, there is an audience that you're speaking or writing to. And same thing in this class. So one thing I'll ask you to consider is, who is your audience? Now, one of your quiz questions for this week is specifically this question: who is your audience? But we're going to help you. Okay, you're not going to just pick an audience out of a hat. You actually have 3 specific choices to choose from, and I'm going to show what those choices are right now. And it means I have to get away from the presentation for just a second. Oops. There we go. Okay, so here's the assignment sheet for the essay draft. And as you can see on page 2, or maybe this is page 3, I forget, the instructions page. Okay, if we look here in kind of the middle of the page, it says begin by choosing an audience. In other words, a reader. Okay, that's who your audience is, whoever is going to be reading your essay. And choose one audience from the 3 following options: potential future employers, industry connections, or your family. Okay, or I like to say people who are close to you, friends, family. So when it comes time to take that quiz, when it comes to writing your paper, you're choosing one of these three audiences. Okay. Now, you're not going to literally create a paper that's addressed to these people. Your essay isn't going to take the form of a letter or anything like, Dear Mom, Dear Aunt Kathy. No, but it's helpful to think about who could potentially read your essay, right? You've all chosen role models to write about. You're all doing research into how they have overcome obstacles because one day you too will enter the industry. And what I like about this assignment is you learn more about your industry than you perhaps already knew, but you're doing so on the sly because you're doing so through this specific essay project. Um, so yeah, you're going to learn more about your industry because you're going to discover the sorts of work-related obstacles that your role model has overcome. In doing so, you can anticipate the sort of things that you'll face one day in the industry. Lots of times, students aren't aware of those things. Some students are, but lots aren't. So how cool is that, right? You'll learn about these sorts of challenges before you enter the industry. That's sort of at least the way I see it. The kind of mini goal of this essay assignment. Um, so it might help you. In week one, we talked about finding your flow. It might help you find the flow of your essay to think about one of these three potential readers. Okay. I mean, will your future employers actually read this essay? Probably not. It might help you to imagine that they would. Right. Your employees would learn a lot about you um, through your impressive essay where you examine your role model's perseverance. They're going to learn a lot about you in turn. After all, if we look at the instructions here on the left, and this might be useful just to recap what we're doing. Notice you're doing three things in this essay, right? You're either choosing one super big problem that your role model faced, and three different ways your role model worked to solve that one big problem. Or, and I think I mentioned this in when I was working the chat last week, most students, for some reason, choose this second option to discuss three separate problems that your role model has faced, and then how your role model solved each one of those. But then look at this stuff here, right? You also have to discuss what you learned from your role model, specifically what you learned about how your role model faced problems and came up with solutions. And then also, how do you think you'll use these problem solving methods in the future, either as part of your degree program here at Full Sail or once you start working in your industry? Okay, so as you can see, the essay is also asking you to reflect upon or about what you learned and how you can apply it. Okay, so the essay is also specific to you. So yeah, if you imagine one of these potential audiences reading your paper, they're also learning about you. They're not just learning about your role model. They're also kind of learning about why this role model is important to you and how it can apply to you. So yeah, for this assignment, you need to pick one of these potential audiences, and when you're writing the paper, to keep them in mind. Okay. Let's see. Am I missing anything in the chat? Corey says, if we have trouble finding problem-solving ideas, should we find brand new ideas and not ones in our last assignments? Um, that's a good question. I would say if you didn't find good examples of either obstacles your role model faced and or how that person solved them, then yeah, absolutely, you should be finding better ideas. You don't want to stick with bad content. Okay. Um, Corey, whose class are you in? Are you in my class? This is embarrassing. I'm still learning students' names. My basic advice is just okay, Miss Chapman's class is to always speak with your instructor. I get hesitant because some instructors may have radically different advice. So you might want to speak to Miss Chapman once the session is over about those things. Um, but yeah, that's a very real situation, Corey. Um, Sometimes students are still working on research past week one. Um, Ms. Fox says, if you're in her class, you must stick with the role model you chose last week, but you're always welcome to go search in better research sources. Right. I think that's what Corey was asking, if he can change his content. Like he's still struggling to find good examples of problems solved. Um, so, okay, yeah, Corey confirms that. Okay, where was I? I got yeah, you're picking. Okay, yeah, just to sum up, you're picking one of these audiences, okay, and keeping them in mind might help you find your flow better um, as you write your paper. And then you have some other things to consider here. And as I mentioned earlier, do read the assignment sheets. I'm always a bit surprised and shocked when students don't read the assignment sheets. That should be something pretty important that you read. So make sure that you go through this because it gives you some sort of guiding prompts here to consider. And these are in place to help you think about your paper and write a solid draft. So make sure you go over that stuff. Okay, let's get back on the program. Yeah, because once you figure out who your audience is, you can start exploring questions like, what do they already know? What do they already know? Or why should they care? What biases might they have about your topic? What will they learn by reading your essay? Or what do you hope they will do, think, or feel after reading your essay? Um, do you have to go through each of these questions literally? No, but these are kind of general questions that hopefully you should be thinking about anyway. For example, sometimes I see students writing way too much from their perspective, and that's an indication that they're not thinking enough about audiences. Um, Audiences often need things explained to them. Um, Instructors do too. If I don't completely understand the problem that your role model faced because it's not concretely being fully described on the page, that's an issue. And that involves issues of, for example, what does your reader already know? Um, if you're a game design student, for example, um, and you're writing about someone who, how do I say it? Your role model is someone involved in gaming, right? Maybe they're in game art, maybe they're in game design. Still, they need some basic things explained to them. Just because there are industry connections doesn't mean you can assume, oh, well, they know it all. I don't have to put my ideas clearly on the page. No, you still do. You can assume that some very, very basic information doesn't need to be explained. Like there are three major consoles out there: the PlayStation, the Wii, and the Xbox. You wouldn't have to explain minutia like that. Uh, but you can't just assume reader knowledge either. And yeah, that's an issue I see sometimes. Gaps in students' papers. And usually those gaps occur because things are not being fully explained. But if you're thinking concretely about an audience, if you can step outside of your own shoes, which is an important skill, by the way, to be able to step outside yourself and look at your paper from the perspective of someone who is not you. Okay? Because when we look at things from our perspective, everything makes sense to us. The words that are on the page, of course, they make complete sense to us because the ideas that rattle around in our brains seem logical to us. But if we can step outside of ourselves and put ourselves in our audience's shoes, that's when interesting stuff occurs. That's when we can notice errors in our paper. That's when we can notice gaps or holes. And this is directly related to issues of audience. Okay, moving forward, okay, we're working on an essay. If we think of essay in its broadest terms possible, it could refer to just about anything, right? In certain ways, even a visual piece could be thought of in terms of an essay. A presentation, if we think in the broadest terms possible, could be considered an essay. Um, but for the purposes of this class, we have a very specific definition for essay, and it's probably the one you already anticipate, right? Which is this a short piece of nonfiction writing on a particular subject. Okay, that's sort of the classic, at least related to academia, definition of an essay. This is what we're working toward. And yeah, it's short. Okay, I mean, we don't give page counts. I think we have it referenced in terms of word counts, which I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's 700 to 1,200 words, which is roughly 2 to 4 pages, and that's not very long at all. I know some of you think that's very long, but because people like Miss Fox and I and Miss Chapman, we've sometimes written 20, 25-page essays. 2 to 4 pages is really not very long, and it's certainly you shouldn't have trouble filling up 2 to 4 pages. Writing about your role model and how they have faced work-related problems. So don't be frightened by the word counts requirements. Okay. Um, but what are we going to put in that essay? Okay. So we're going to take a moment here and kind of review some basics. Some of you probably got this information in high school, or if you've taken a college level course elsewhere, you might have received it. I'm going to cover it quickly because I'm going to assume that some of you have heard this information before, but it never hurts to review. So when we think about an essay, it has an introduction, right? This is your opening paragraph. It could be two paragraphs if you're writing a really ambitious introduction. For most of you, though, it's probably going to be a single paragraph. Um, and the introduction is, well, it's exactly as it sounds, right? It's the sort of greeting. It's the sort of opening move that your essay makes. Your introduction has very very specific goals that it tries to reach. Ideally, it should grab the reader's attention somehow. It's also going to present your general topic at hand, and that it should end with a thesis. And a thesis is simply a single sentence or two, but usually it's a single sentence that appears near the end of the introduction that simply defines the paper. Okay. So if we think of an introduction, I got a little bit ahead of myself by bringing up the second bullet point. So let's start that over. So if we think about the introduction paragraph, yeah, ideally it should grab the reader's attention, define the general topic of your paper, and end with a thesis. So if we think of that in practical terms, hopefully you can come up with some interesting way to begin. Then your paragraph probably needs to mention your role model and the theme of perseverance. Okay, maybe your paragraph begins by talking about your role model in general and then narrows down to the issue of perseverance. Maybe it begins the opposite. Maybe it begins with some general comments about perseverance and narrows down to your specific role model. Okay, you have options. But notice how we're staying general. We're not diving, excuse me, we're not diving into any specifics yet. Sometimes I see students' papers and the very first paragraph, we're already talking about work-related obstacle number one. And quotations are appearing, and statistics and facts, and it's from the instructor's perspective, it's like, no, 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 hold on, that belongs elsewhere. The introduction is just a general greeting. We're kind of saying hello to the readers. Okay, we're warming them up for the information that's to come. We're not hitting them with that information yet. So yeah, the introduction stays general. Then comes the support. We also think of this as the body of the paper. Okay, those middle paragraphs where the bulk of your content is going to appear. And this is where you will get into, yes, presenting your work-related obstacles that your role model encountered, how she or he solved them, and then the other stuff that we covered on the assignment sheet, right? What you learned from it, how it can be applied, etc. And finally, there has to be a conclusion, which is in some ways the mirror of the introduction. It sort of echoes, it does not repeat, it echoes the information in the introduction. It sort of revisits the bigger general ideas in your paper and finds a satisfying way to bring the essay to a close. Okay, so most of you know this stuff, right? You've probably heard of this before: introduction, body, conclusion. Let's see. Alex says, as far as references go, using the library database and full sale, what is accepted as one? There's a Gamma Sutra link. Does that count? Yes, it does. And Alex, how do I put this kindly? This was covered last week, okay? In the week one lecture, we talked about the full sale library database, and Miss Fox mentioned Gamma Sutra and how, yes, it counts as a database link or a database requirement because it is listed there on the library databases page. And there's just a refresher of what I went over, right? Introduction, what introduction does. I should just say with the thesis statement, remember, I just said the thesis statement is probably a single sentence or two that ends your introduction, that defines the terms of your paper. For all of you, your thesis statement is probably going to be a single sentence or two that pretty much makes some sort of statement about that mentions your role model, the issue of perseverance, and what you learned from it, right? It's going to touch on those three themes probably. Um, And there's just a review of what the body of the paper includes and the conclusion. Okay, because I covered this already. That's why I'm kind of remaining silent. If you need to take a screenshot of any of this, you probably should, or you can just revisit this part of the lecture after the fact, because there is some important, like, one idea per paragraph. That's pretty key, and I may say more about that in the next few slides. Okay, so if we think about the focus of these papers, we're all writing about role models and perseverance, right? There are basically three things, again, and these are directly, it's just what I covered on the assignment sheet, the instructions. Three things we're covering. What you discovered about how your role model persevered against setbacks, obstacles, failure. What you learned about perseverance from your role model, and how you plan to apply what you learned to achieving your own personal goals. Okay, so these are kind of the three key areas that your paper has to cover. It's important to keep these three things in mind because these can actually help you organize your essay. Because when we think about it, our paper should be trying to achieve some sense of balance. And if sections of our paper are too top heavy, like we do an awesome job talking about how our role model overcame obstacles, but we spend very little time talking about what we've learned or how we can apply what we've learned. That creates a sense of imbalance, and it's pretty noticeable. And I do see this, and it's actually a pretty common occurrence. I'll see students who do a terrific job. They'll present work-related obstacle number one. They'll define it. They'll describe it. They'll also go into detail about how specifically their role model dealt with it. Everything's awesome. But then when it's time to talk about this stuff, it's like one sentence, right? They have one or two sentences to say. And that's not balanced. We should be treating the different sections of our paper with roughly the same amount of space. And I should say that, the stuff where you have to discuss what you learned from your role model and how you can apply it, that's probably the number one area that I see gets short shrift in the essays. Students, for some reason, really struggle with this. Um, Let me bear with me. I'm going to go to the assignment sheet real quickly. Okay, so we're back on the assignment sheet here. I always say that the secret is to really look at these bulleted points here and make sure that you're answering them. For example, what you learn from your role model about problems you may encounter and their possible solution. So that means you should be brainstorming, okay, about what sorts of problems you might encounter in the future, and then how will you use, okay, the same sorts of problem-solving methods that your role model did in order to persevere in your degree program in industry. So it requires stepping back and really thinking about the type of projects you might work on while you're at Full Sail. It might mean thinking about your industry once you enter it and what types of situations you might find yourself in. So if you're really looking at these bullet points and answering them specifically and with care, you shouldn't have that problem of not having much to say in the essay and thus creating an imbalance. Hold on, my cursor disappeared. Hold on. Okay, there we go. This happens sometimes when I go back and forth. Okay. One final thing. I often joke with students that when it comes to discussing what you learned and how you can apply it, you should be coming up with the sort of specific information that a big dummy like me couldn't, right? So if you stay very general and just say, "Oh, from my role model, uh, I learned how to never give up," or "I learned to think outside of the box," or "I learned that when life throws me lemons, I'll make lemonade," or something like that, right? Like I could come up with that, and I know nothing about your fields. So hopefully you're coming up with more specific information than that you're actually anticipating the sorts of things you might encounter, and how you might be able to use your role models, problem solving techniques when you enter the industry. Okay, so if we think of the essay itself and what we were just talking about, that there are basically three main areas to cover, this can help you organize your essay. Okay, so here are the 3 points we just covered in the white box here. This specific structure probably works really well with the if you have one giant problem you're discussing and three solutions. that, or three methods that your role model used to try to fix that problem. I know that this is kind of repeated here, but yeah, some students might define that one single Uber problem in great detail, right? So the reader understands what it is, and then they'll go through their solutions one at a time, and then they'll make sure that they devote equal space to what they learned from the role models in a separate paragraph, and then another paragraph or two where they explain how they can apply what they've learned. Or students may use, and this is probably the structure I more often see, um, which is we take each of these kind of in turn, right? This one works specifically well with the students who decide to discuss three separate problems. Um, I'm just curious from the people in the room. Is there anybody in the room who thinks they're going to do the one giant super big problem and three different methods that your role model used to solve it? Oh, Jameson says he is. Okay, cool. Calvin says he tried it. Okay. I'm going to assume that maybe everybody else is going to probably. Yeah, I don't know why it is, but yeah, most students choose the three different problems and then how the role model solved each one. And so this structure works out really well for this, right? Because you're basically dealing with them one at a time in order. So we begin with one problem, discuss how your role model, discuss what the problem is, right? Define it, explain how your role model solved it, and then discuss what you learned and how you can apply it. And then repeat with problem number two, problem number three. The important thing here is, though, you actually have flexibility. Um, you can organize things pretty much however you wish, just as long as you're sticking with sound organizational principles. So a few slides ago, it mentioned one idea per paragraph. So you certainly don't want to be mixing lots of different things in a single paragraph. But yeah, you have freedom to organize things how you wish. So for example, I've had students, for example, who will have three pretty richly developed body paragraphs where they'll spend roughly half the paragraph talking about the problem, half the paragraph explaining what their role model did to solve that problem. Then they'll move on to problem number two, then problem number three, and they'll save the discussion of what they learned and how they can apply it for the end of the paper. Um, or, if a student really has just a ton to say, maybe they have one single paragraph devoted to the problem and a separate paragraph devoted to the solution. And then they move on to the next problem. That creates a lot of paragraphs, and you have to be careful not to go over the word counts. But you do have options, okay? You just have to make sure that you have a sound organizational system in place. Okay, before we shift gears, because now we're going to talk about APA formats and how to incorporate research, any questions we have at this point about what we've covered regarding the essay, what it's seeking to do, how we might organize the essay, etc. Any questions, or are we good to move forward? I'm going to interpret that silence as let's move on. Jameson says, can it be over 5 pages? That sounds a bit long, right? We're talking typically 250 words, sometimes 300 can fit on a single page. And the word count limit is what, Miss Fox? Isn't it 1,200, 700 to 1,200 words? So 5 pages sounds like it's over that. Oh, 1,400 words. Okay, then it might go on to a 5th page. Yeah, Jameson, just use the word count feature in Microsoft Word to make sure that you're not going over 1,400 words. But yeah, you might run on to a 5th page. But if you're going over 5 pages, that probably sounds too long. Okay, so let's talk about using research to support. This gets into issues of APA, which, according to the quizzes I just graded, seems to be one of the major things that students are afraid of. You're probably wondering why a sandwich just appeared on the page. It's because it's getting close to dinner time. No, we're going to use a sandwich metaphor to talk about how to incorporate research. APA, as I mentioned earlier in the session, really covers issues, kind of two different sides. One is issues of layout, how your paper needs to look. So that includes issues like margins, spacing, having a cover page, having an appropriate font size and style. But the other part of APA, which is probably equally important, maybe probably even more important, because you don't want to get into trouble with issues of plagiarism, are issues of citation and the creation of references. So right now we're going to use an example where we show how to incorporate research into your writing and to do so following APA format. Okay, so we're going to introduce this in terms of what's called the quote sandwich, because if you can think about incorporating research in terms of building a sandwich, it might help you um, put things together correctly and to incorporate research into your paper in a way that's natural, because there's nothing more unnatural than to see research just appear out of nowhere. Um, I often call that carpet bombing, or I call it photo bombing, right? Photo bombing is when someone either intentionally or accidentally disturbs one's photo. That's kind of the feeling one has when they're reading a paper and everything's going good, and then boom, whammo, a quotation or some other form of research just appears out of the blue. We don't want that. We always want to set things up for our readers. And if we keep the sandwich metaphor in mind, that will help ensure that we're doing exactly that. So, using the sandwich metaphor, there's what's called the setup. This is like the top slice of our sandwich, right? The top slice of bread. This is our main point. It's the idea that we're writing about. Okay? It's whatever we're saying at that moment. It might be argumentative, it might be an explanation, it might be a fact, but it's the idea that you're currently working with, and now you know you want to use a quotation to support this point. So, for example, look at this statement here, which we'll imagine is whatever idea that we're currently writing about. Okay, a BLT, bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwich is extremely hard to resist because humans are chemically drawn to bacon. So obviously you won't be writing this kind of sentence in your own paper, but let's imagine we're writing a paper about food, okay? And this is the idea that we're currently working with. So this is our setup. Now we're getting ready to include the quotation, but we don't just drop in quotations, right? Because that's awkward. We need to introduce it. So the introducing of the quote is kind of like the tomato in the sandwich, okay? Here, the introduction means introducing the author of the quotation. Okay, because in general, we don't want to leave the reader guessing on the origin of that quotation. So we'll identify who the author is. Okay, so for example, according to Ellen Roberts is the author. Next, it's often nice if we can explain who the author is, because if we just say Ellen Roberts, people might think, okay, awesome. Who's Ellen Roberts? So if we can take a moment to define who she is, that's useful. So defining this information, including it, is kind of like this, the lettuce on the sandwich. Okay, we're providing the author's credentials, which establishes authority. We're kind of showing that we're actually citing an expert in the field. So, according to Ellen Roberts, head of public engagement at the Center for Life in Newcastle. So, okay, so that information sounds impressive, right? Because now we know who Ellen Roberts is. And if you're a reader, you're probably thinking, wow, this person sounds important. I probably want to hear what she has to say. Finally, we get to the good stuff, okay, the meat. Or if you're a vegetarian or vegan, replace the bacon with whatever substitute bacon product you want. But this is the quotation itself, okay? These are these author's exact words. We have to make sure it's relevant to our point and that it's actually helping lend credence to our ideas. There's a funny comparison here. Think of it this way, right? You want yummy, crunchy, gourmet bacon, not processed, floppy, garbage bacon, right? So we have to make sure that our quotations are actually good and useful. When we just stick in anything, that's the equivalent of putting like garbage bacon in the middle there. But we have a really good quote here. The smell of sizzling bacon in a pan is enough to tempt even the staunchest of vegetarians. There's something deeper going on inside. It's not just the idea of a tasty snack. There is some complex chemistry going on. Okay, so there's Ellen Roberts' quotation. We're not done though. Okay, don't forget the quotation marks. This is like the mayo on the sandwich. Uh, it seems like it's small. It seems like it's something not so important, just like the condiment, but it's super important. Okay, without the quotation marks, you're technically plagiarizing, because if you don't put quotation marks, what you're suggesting is yes, the information comes from Ellen Roberts, but without quotation marks, you're suggesting that the words are entirely your own. These aren't your own words, though, so you have to put them in quotation marks. And I can't stress this enough, because I do see students make this mistake. And then they come back to me afterwards and say, oh, but I indicated Ellen Roberts' name, and we'll get to the actual citation in a moment. And I included a parenthetical citation. That's not plagiarism. And I say, yes, it is, because without the quotation marks, you're suggesting that this is your language. So, no, we need to put those quotation marks in there. Still, we're not completely done. It's awkward just to include a quotation and then not say anything after it. It's super awkward when you end a paragraph that way. So yeah, we need to comment. This is like the bottom slice of toast. Okay, we explain the quotation's relevance in terms of the point we're trying to make. So bacon's peel is not just in the taste buds. The scent actually penetrates the brain with chemical messages that scream, "I'm yummy." And I'm not going to ask you to read this entire section here, but if you scan it, you'll see that this is very readable, right? The reader doesn't stumble at all. The reader can begin here, end here, uh, and do so, naturally. That's what we're aiming for. So if you keep the sandwich metaphor in mind, you shouldn't run into problems with research just appearing out of the blue. Finally, we need to deal with the citation. Okay, we've indicated Ellen Roberts. We've put quotation marks around the quote, but we're not done. Okay, we need to include an in-text citation. We need to signal to the reader where this information comes from. In-text citations are sort of shorthand, because the references page, which comes at the very end of the essay, gives fuller information. So the reader can find the exact source on his or her own if she wants to. But in text, we do have to include some information. This is similar to like a napkin for cleanup. Okay, we have to tidy up the quote. We're not done yet. And here's how it might look. Okay, the citation here. Anytime we mention the author's name in our actual sentence. Okay, and this is what we've done here by saying according to Ellen Roberts. If we use the author's name in our sentence, we immediately have to put the year of publication in parentheses. That's not optional. There are ways to handle quotation where we don't include the author's name in our sentence, but we're trying to teach that you should probably get in the habit of doing so. But yeah, when we do, immediately year in parentheses. And then after the quotation is over, we have another parenthetical where we put a page or a paragraph number. Now, why do I say page or paragraph number? If you find something through EBSCOhost, especially if it's a PDF file, the PDF file is going to be an exact scan of the actual magazine pages. So there will be page numbers to include. However, online articles, for instance, often don't have page numbers, right? You just keep scrolling down to continue reading the article. In those cases where there are no page numbers, we just count the paragraphs and then indicate which paragraph it's in. If we had a page number to cite, we would just put a lowercase p, period, 6 if it was on page 6. Okay, but there's a citation. But the in-text citation is what we do immediately when we not just directly quote something, but anytime we incorporate research or facts or statistics in the actual body of our essay. But there's also a reference, okay? This appears at the end of the paper. This gives fuller information about what we've just provided an in-text citation for. Okay, again, the references go at the end of the essay and might look like this. Okay, author, always last name, first initial, date, title of the article, where it came from. And I'm going to show this in a bit, but you have some materials to look at to help you with APA that explains, for example, how to create references. Oops, I think I actually clicked on the The article. Hold on. Okay, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so citing research. My cursor keeps disappearing. Okay, let's try this again. There we go. Okay, citing research. First, let me indicate why it's important to cite research. And this might be a quiz question on this week's weekly check-in. Anybody want to take a stab? Why do you think it's important to cite research? Who wants to show off? Who wants to give some ideas about why we should be, because sometimes students think, why do I have to cite this? I mean, come on. I put quotation marks around it. That's fine. Why do I have to take time to create a references page? Jan says, because you need to respect the one who made it. Okay, good. That's a key reason, right? We have to give credit where credit is due. Some person worked very hard to come up with information that we're quoting or we're citing, okay? Or someone conducted a research study from which we're taking facts or statistics. We have to give credit where credit is due. Oh, James mentions an important one: credibility. Wow. It's like you guys are ready to take the quiz without without going over it. Yeah, because I had kind of three key examples to give. One was the one that was mentioned. We have to give credit where credit is due. And the one James mentioned, credibility, right? It adds to our credibility as authors when we can use quality research as support. There's nothing more awkward than reading a student paper that's written entirely from her perspective, right? The whole thing is written off the top of her head. It's written from the gut, and it just lacks that authority, right? You actually establish credibility when you can turn to other sources for support. So yeah, bingo. Let's see, what did other people say? James says legality. Okay, I think I know what that means. I mean, listen, you're not going to get arrested for plagiarizing, but you'll get an F on the assignment. So I guess, yeah, when it comes to university policy, it's not a legality issue, but it's certainly a course policy issue. I don't know what happens in the real world if you plagiarize. I guess you could be subject to a lawsuit, right? Yeah, Ms. Fox says that, so I guess that's a possibility. Al says giving credit to the original author who made the primary source. Right. Yeah. So I think we covered the three ones I wanted to cover. We have to give credit where credit is due. Um, it's an issue of just creating authority or credibility for ourselves. And yeah, we want to avoid plagiarism, right? We don't want to get into academic dishonesty issues. It's a policy or full sale. Actually, it's a policy just about any school, right? We don't plagiarize. So if you can come up with those three answers on your weekly check-in, you should be good to go. But that's why we cite. And just real quickly, because we're going to wrap things up, just some comments about APA. APA isn't difficult, but it does require attention to detail. I can't stress that enough. If you take the time, okay, and it might take an hour or more to just learn the basic foundation of APA, but if you take the time to do that, then you're good. I always say that APA is super easy. It's easy peasy. It really is. Students don't believe it, but it is. But it does require attention to detail. Um, and yeah, the purpose of APA is to give credit to sources in a logical, globally understood way. That is key, because for every student who says, well, who cares if it's single spaced or double spaced, or I didn't create the cover page perfectly, or I'm using a font size or style that's, 14 size, but it's supposed to be 12. Who cares? Or, I cited it. Maybe I didn't cite it perfectly, but I included the information. But think of it this way. Imagine if 25 students hand in 25 papers that all look radically different. One person's citing things the way she wants to, another student's doing it a different way. One student's just slapping URLs down for a reference. Another person's including more information. All the papers are completely different in terms of layouts. I mean, that's just chaos. So the purpose of any style system, whether it's APA, MLA, Chicago, is to create a stable, logical way for handling information. Readers like stability. Okay, we like harmony. We don't like chaos. Um, I'm trying to catch up in the chat. What did Ms. Chapman say? The biggest issue I see with in-text citations is that students will have lots of ideas from an outside source in a paragraph, and then only one in-text citation at the end of the paragraph. Be sure to cite each and every idea from an outside source. Okay, yeah, good. Um, and I read that out loud because people who watch the video after the fact cannot see what's typed in the chat. So something important is said. I want to make sure I echo it. Finally, understanding how to cite sources will help you in your future career. I mean, yeah, are you going to deal with APA in your future career? Probably not. But I think there's something valuable about being able to follow instructions. Um, no matter what industry you're going into, the company you work for, even if you're working on your own, you're going to have certain processes in place that you have to follow. If we have anybody from web design or graphic design, you may be working someplace that has a very specific in-house style. Like you can only use a certain font or a certain color scheme, or you're forbidden to use certain fonts or certain color schemes because it violates the in-house policy. So yeah, I mean, will you use AP in the future? Probably not. But I do think there is a bigger lesson learned here. That no matter what field you're going into, you're going to have to follow rules. You're going to have to follow guidelines. You can't just do things the way you want to. There is a system to follow. Uh, we've kind of covered this. Each citation has two parts. You always have to have both. Okay. Um, I'm sorry. One is the references page citation. Okay, so this is something that appears at the end of the paper. This is on a separate page. So when you get to the end of the essay, you're going to keep hitting enter or return till you get to a brand new sheet of paper. Okay, and when you get to that brand new page, that's where you're going to create your references page. Okay, and this is where you include detailed information about your source. We looked at an example earlier, by the way. And yeah, this allows your readers to go find that source and investigate further. And it's pretty important that you do this because I actually do go to your sources. And it's super frustrating when you don't follow APA format because then I have to go to the library database and search for your source other ways. But I shouldn't have to do that. Whether you have copied words from a source or use idea or information from the source, you must cite the source on your references page. Okay? So, um, yeah, I mean, if you're using sources on any level, it needs to be on the references page. Okay, sometimes students think, well, if I'm not directly quoting, I don't have to cite it. Yeah, you do, in text and on the references page. And here's some examples. If we think of the references page in terms of who, when, what, where, that's basically what we're filling in. So who, the author, last name, first initial. When, that's where we put the date in parentheses. What, the article itself. This is where we put the article title, and then issues of where. Okay, what magazine was it published in, or etc. And here's actually an example for a film. So if any of you have maybe some of you did find videos, or maybe some of you have a DVD documentary that you want to use as research. Here's a really good example of how to cite a film. Okay, that's what you would put on your references page. Okay, so that's one part, a references page. The other part is the in-text citations, which we just went through in our extended sandwich example. These go directly in the text of your essay. They're short, okay? They're meant to be short, so they don't interrupt things too much. They go in parentheses immediately after the quotation. And they basically help identify where ideas or direct language, where it came from. And that's pretty key too, because some students think, oh, well, if I don't quote something directly, I don't need to cite it. Yes, you do. Even if you paraphrase and put things in your own words, if what you're putting in your own words originates from research, meaning you could never have come up with that idea on your own, you need to cite it, just like we did with the sandwich example. The only difference is you wouldn't be putting the words in quotation marks because you're using your own words. And in-text citations are really just a matter of who and when. Okay, so basically, in-text citations can include someone's last name and the year of publication. For example, Watkins, 2014. And here's some examples. And I do want to show that you do have two options. The sandwich example focused more on this second option here, where we mention an author's name in the actual sentence. And whenever you do that, you immediately put your publication in parentheses, then deliver your quotation or your facts or your cited, or excuse me, your paraphrase research, and then in parentheses afterwards include a page or paragraph number. Or, and there are instances, I mean, we're trying to encourage students to get in the habit of using the author's name in the sentence, just because in some ways it's easier. But there are times where maybe it's not that important to mention the author's name in your actual sentence, especially if the person you're citing isn't that important. Um, if so, there's a way where you can just deliver your information naturally, and you can save everything for a citation after the research appears. This is probably the confusing part about APA, is that you always have a kind of there are always two ways to handle in-text citations. And in a second, I'm going to point to some really important materials where you can learn more about APA that will make these things crystal clear. Here's one of them, projectapa.info. Let's see if clicking on this opens things up. This was made by a fellow Full Sail instructor. And what's great about this site is it only includes the sorts of information that students would need. So it doesn't get so much into the esoteric stuff that maybe a full APA manual would. So, for example, Intext citations. And you should maybe write this down, or maybe go to projectapa.info right now and bookmark it. Because, for example, you can go to Intext citations and go, okay, let's see, I have a work by multiple authors. You can click on that. Or if you just want to get the gist, you can go to the first one here. And yeah, it explains just what I covered, right? There are always two formats to incorporate a quotation. And then it shows the two formats, okay? Including the author's name in your sentence, followed by your publication, and then a page or paragraph number at the end, or saving everything for the end. So if you go to projectapa.info and read through this information carefully, you will not be confused by in-text citations. Again, APA really is easy. It's just you have to spend the time going through this. If you don't, then yes, APA is going to seem like a bunch of random, pointless, confusing rules. But of course, because if you don't spend the hour or so reading through this information, of course it's going to seem confusing. But for students who do take the time, it really is easy. And because 20 points of your essay is essentially for APA format, I always say that it's the easiest 20 points to earn or the easiest 20 points to lose. While I've wandered away from the presentation, let me quickly show. Okay, so if we go to the essay assignment itself, and I apologize for not having this open already. This is the essay draft assignment. Okay, so assignment 2, composing with care. This is what to do this Sunday. You'll notice under the download section, you have a lot of things. I mean, you have the instruction sheets, but you also have this, APA Basics, what you need to know. It's a PDF file. I'm going to go ahead and open that. You also have what's called the Visual Guide to APA. I'm going to go ahead and open that. And let's start with the APA Basics Guide. This was created by Ms. Fox. APA Basics, what you need to know. And my promise is, if you go through this PDF and read it with care, you'll be fine. Okay, you won't be confused about in-text citations. Again, and I don't mean to be mean. I don't want to be that harsh instructor. But yeah, the students who struggle with APA are the ones who don't read this information. Okay, they just make things up. They don't take the time. And I understand we're all busy, so I'm not trying to point fingers or point blame. It's tough to carve out time to go over this information. I realize that, but please find the hour or so to do so, because then APA will not be a problem. You also have this, the visual guide to APA, and this shows you issues of layouts. Okay, so you need a header, which is like the top half inch of your page, and it shows you what the header should contain. It shows that all margins should be set to 1 inch. It also includes small notes about not just what the header includes, but like how you should, even tips on how to create it, like Microsoft Word. To create the header, you actually just have to double click near the top of the page, and the header automatically opens it. and other stuff. Okay, you can read through this on your own, but it gives you a visual example of what a properly formatted paper in terms of layout looks like. Okay, because your paper has to look like this. And again, it's not difficult at all, at all. And Project APA, it also includes, I think, some step-by-step instructions for how to create the cover page and how to make your paper look like this. Okay. But yeah, you're graded on this, so make sure that you don't lose points for this. Let's see. Is that the last slide? I think it is. Yeah, just real quickly. Purdue University has an awesome online writing lab. You just Google all APA, or sometimes I just Google Purdue APA and it gets me there. The Full Sail Writing Center is something you should also take advantage of. Whether you're a campus student or an online student, you have access to tutors. If you're an online student, the sessions occur online, and you'll often work with someone who knows APA format. Okay. Yay, that's the last slide. Okay, question and answer time. I know we covered a lot of stuff. Um, Everything from the essay assignment itself to how to organize it to how to incorporate quotations to APA. We just scratched the surface on APA. Okay, so this session does not cover everything. So you really do have to spend some time with those supplemental documents or with projectapa.info to get a fuller sense of how APA works. But now's the time for questions if you have them. Okay, Jan says, just to be 100% clear, this assignment is due Sunday. Yes, unless your instructor changed the dates or create an extension, it's due on Sunday. Um, you're welcome, Jameson, who's going to disappear. But yeah, if you don't have questions, I'm not going to force you to stay here. So if you are comfortable with what we covered, you are free to go enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks so much for attending. I will hang out for a little bit, though, and answer questions from students who have them. Could I send you drafts before Sunday? Jan, are you in my class? Oh, okay, you are. First, I apologize for not knowing that. Yeah, certainly you can send me drafts before Sunday. I'd be happy to look at them. You're welcome, sir. Any other questions? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording because all this silence near the end is really, really awkward for people who watch it after the fact.